The question is this: what happens? You ready? What happens when Jesus gives the final exam? That's interesting. And what happens when Jesus gives the final exam and it feels like maybe up to that point you failed, or at least you were failing? I tend to think maybe that's the experience of Peter. You guys know Peter in the Bible, right? I think Peter had that experience, and I think maybe Peter might have thought he was failing the test, the course. You know the story of Peter, right? Fast forward the story of Peter, Luke 5, you can look at the story of Peter. Rough, tumble fisherman. I love Peter. He meets the carpenter's son turned preacher. Doesn't take long for the carpenter's son turned preacher to turn Peter's boat into a pulpit, right? And all of a sudden, then the carpenter's son turned preacher gives Peter, the rough and tumble, experienced fisherman, some fishing advice. He resists at first and eventually surrenders, and then they have this incredible catch of fish. And Peter's eyes open up. He's like, man, I think this guy might be the real deal. Jesus says, follow me and I'll make you. You remember the story, fisher of men. And so Peter begins to follow him, and when he begins to follow him, Peter all of a sudden is like, maybe this guy's the real deal. He saw Jesus do some incredible things. Pretty incredible. You go heal a leper. You restore the limbs of a paralyzed guy. That's pretty incredible. Feed 5,000 men plus women and children with a little boy's lunch. That's really, really, really cool. And then raise a dead guy. That is awesome. He didn't just see him do incredible things. He heard him teach incredible things. Jesus had a way of taking little stories that had really, really big ideas, and he had this way of gathering a crowd. Everything was going great. Peter, following Jesus, left everything to follow Jesus until it wasn't going that great. All of a sudden, Jesus started saying things that were head-scratching, maybe a little bit uncomfortable, things that you wouldn't expect somebody that was going to take over, we're going to follow you to take over, you wouldn't expect him to say. Things like this: if you want to be great, serve. You want to find your life, lose it. And then there was that whole event that Peter would have remembered when Jesus went around to each of the 12 and he washed their feet. And Peter's like, I don't think I feel good about this. And Jesus is like, if you don't feel good about it, then you have no part with me. And then Peter's like, I'm all in. And then Jesus said this. He's like, I'm going to die. They're going to kill me. And Peter's like, I'm going to die with you. Even if all these guys leave you, you can count on me. You remember that? And Jesus is like, it's probably not going to go down that way. It's probably not going to go down that way. But you got to give Peter some credit, right? Because of the 12, one of them betrayed him, the rest of them deserted him. Peter stuck around. And he was there when they arrested and tried Jesus. And that's when fisherman turned follower, you ready, finds himself around a fire. Do you remember the story? Not once, not twice. Do you remember? But 3 times. 3 times somebody came up to Peter and said, hey, aren't you associated with that guy that they're trying? Aren't you associated with Jesus? Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Do you remember? Peter's like, not me. I don't know him. And the book of Luke says this, fascinating. Not only did a rooster crow, that's interesting. Jesus said it would happen. But the book of Luke says at that very moment, Jesus turned and his eyes caught Peter's eyes. That would have been a moment. Peter had to be feeling like he was failing. They took that Jesus, they tried him, arrested him, tried him, then they killed him. And if you know the story, the dead Jesus, they buried in a borrowed tomb. He didn't stay dead. That's good news. Can I get an amen on that? That's good news. Yeah. That's good news. And now the alive Jesus, the grave is empty. Peter, one of the first ones to go see the empty grave. Fascinating. And then Jesus appears to the disciples. And then all of a sudden you begin to think and let your mind go, I wonder what Peter is thinking now. Because here's what you find, that the follower of Jesus is now fishing again. He's in a familiar spot. We find him in a very familiar spot doing a familiar thing. He's out fishing with a familiar result. He's getting skunked. He's not catching anything. And he's out there with his buddies and he hears a voice. It sounds kind of familiar and it has a very familiar instruction to it. Why don't you all cast your net on the other side? They didn't recognize who it was. They didn't recognize who it was right away. But they did what the voice said, and when they did, all of a sudden it had a familiar result. They pulled in 153 very large fish. All of a sudden, Peter's like, I know who that voice belongs to. That belongs to Jesus. And so he does a very familiar thing. He jumps out the boat. This time he doesn't walk on the water. He just runs through the water and he gets to the shore. Stay with me. And when he gets there where Jesus is at, there is a very familiar smell. Because Jesus, you with me? He's sitting around a charcoal fire cooking breakfast. And I have a feeling that Peter would have remembered that smell. Because the last time he smelled that smell, people came to him and said, "Don't you belong to him?" And he's like, "Uh-uh." And it's around that charcoal fire that Jesus decides to administer the final exam. 3 years of following Jesus reduced down to a final exam with 3 questions. Maybe a better way to say it is 1 question 3 times. Jesus has this exam for Peter. And what's interesting is what Jesus asked, and maybe what's even more interesting to me is what he doesn't ask, because Peter, he doesn't say, "Peter, what was the most important thing that I taught you about prayer?" That's not what he asked him. He doesn't come to Peter and say, "Hey, what were the main points of the Sermon on the Mount?" He doesn't ask him that. No, true or false. He has 1 question that he asked 3 times. It's found in John 21. I think we'll throw it on the screen. Can I just show it to you and then make some observations of what God's doing in my heart? And then we'll dismiss. 15, chapter 21. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John," here it is. First question, "Do you love me more than these?" "Well, yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Then feed my lambs." Verse 16, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John," here's the second question. Sounds like the first question. "Do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Then take care of my sheep." Verse 17, do you see it? The third time. Can we just stop for a minute and let the Bible come alive? Do you think Peter might have had PTSD, right? Post-third question syndrome, right? Like, I think he might have had that. Like, just let the Bible be real. Let it just kind of lean in on you for a second. I think he might have had that. The third time, he said to him, "Simon, son of John," here it is, "do you love me?" It says Peter was hurt. I bet he was, because Jesus was asking him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." It's interesting to me. 3 final questions to the guy who denied him 3 times. Do you love me? What's interesting is Jesus, the professor, is making it very obvious what he wants the takeaway to be. And the takeaway is 1 question that he asked 3 times. I think it's interesting as we go into our day, maybe to think about what Jesus was saying to Peter, what he was asking Peter. I think the first thing that I think, and I have written down in my Bible, is this: do I love Jesus? Don't answer that too quick. Like, do I love Jesus? That's an interesting question. I would actually say it's a penetrating question. It's a great question. It's an exposing question. It's one that none of us, I think, should answer really, really fast. Because the question is this: do I love Jesus? Do I love Jesus? Or do I love simply what Jesus does for me? That's an interesting question. Do I love Jesus, or do I love the benefits and the blessings of coming along with Jesus? I mean, the whole forgiveness thing, right? Escape the wrath of God thing, the whole abundant life, eternal life thing. Like, who doesn't want to go to heaven? But the question isn't that. The question is, do I love Jesus? I found this quote fascinating to me. John Piper said it this way. I think we might have it for the screen. He said, "The critical question for our generation, every generation, is this: if you could have heaven, no sickness, with all the friends you ever had on earth, all the food you ever liked, all the leisure activities you ever enjoyed, all the natural beauties you ever saw, all the physical pleasures you ever tasted, and no human conflict or any natural disasters, could you be satisfied with heaven?" Wait for it. "If Christ was not there." That's an interesting question. You see, sometimes when we talk about this whole thing of following Jesus, Christianity, we talk about the benefits and the blessings. And like I was just with a group of guys, and they said, "Hey, what are you looking forward to most about heaven?" And we went around, and everybody's talking about all these things, the streets of gold, and this incredible this and that and this and that. And the fact of the matter, what he's asking is this: would I be satisfied with heaven without Jesus? You see, the question is, do you love Jesus? Do I love Jesus? He's saying, "Peter, do you love me?" That's the question. You see, I don't know what you think, but Jesus is going back to you, to your office, your cubicle, and if he were to sit beside you and he is there with you, I wonder what comes to your mind when you think about what he might ask you. Like, I honestly think sometimes we get the question wrong in our head, and we think, well, I think if Jesus was here, he'd say, "What were you thinking? Why in the world did you do that? Or he might ask us if we had enough information, if we were doing enough activity, and maybe, just maybe, today, while you're working, helping tons of people, maybe Jesus, who's working with you, sitting there with you, that you're co-partnering with, maybe the question he has, hey, do you love me?